Welcome. My name is Louis Hoffman, and I'm a faculty member at Saybrook University. This lecture is the beginning of a course on effective therapy and healing in a diverse world. If you found this lecture and you're not enrolled in the class, please feel free to watch along and ponder the questions on your own, or consider taking the class at a future time. This class is offered through Facebook, and it's open to individuals who are students at Saybrook and people who are not students at Saybrook. And one of the exciting things about this is that we'll hopefully have a very diverse group of people that are involved in the class. So let me just speak to that real quickly as we get started here. The people who are involved in this discussion, it may include people who are therapists or studying to become therapists, as well as people that don't have any interest in ever being a therapist. I think that this is one of the helpful things about this class, is that we'll be coming at the idea of healing and from a diverse perspective. And in particular, we're going to be interested in psychological or emotional healing, but we're going to consider it broader than that and in a holistic manner also. And really the idea is that the course can go wherever it goes, that we want it to be able to be driven as much by your input along the way as about any preconceived notions. And so one of the things that I ask as we get started in this class is do your best to clear your assumptions about therapy, about healing, about diversity, about effectiveness, all of these things that we're going to be talking about in this class. Try and clear your mind. Start the journey fresh. One of the reasons that I ask this is because what limits us often in therapy is that we get too focused in on this is the way that we go about healing. And it's not just true in therapy, it's true as we go about healing in a number of different ways. Our culture is obsessed with these prescribed ways of healing, 7 steps to overcome grief, or 10 steps to overcome your anger, 12 steps to overcome your substance abuse addiction. We like these nice, neat packages a lot of times. And those work for some people, but they don't always work. And that's one of the things we want to consider is how do you design healing and how do you look at healing to the unique individual? And so healing may be very different. Yalom talks about how we need to design a new therapy for everyone that we work with. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. When we look at healing, we're always creating a new path that together with that individual, and often that's going to be what's most effective. I imagine some people are very interested in their role as a healer, and I imagine some other people in this course may be interested in healing beyond just the individual level, maybe looking at healing from a cultural perspective or a social perspective, healing groups. And I imagine there's also people that are interested, at least in part, in their own healing. And all of these things, I think, will be factors that are relevant as we go along in this course. Let me begin by unpacking the title, just briefly, and then we're going to go through and unpack this a little bit more. When talking about effective, what works? By what standards does it work? These are some of the things that we're going to be looking at here. That, again, effectiveness needs to be understood in a very broad way. We start to see, and I'll talk a little bit about how in the field of psychology, for example, there have become very prescribed ideas about what is effective and what should be considered effective. And maybe this is not what fits everyone. So that needs to be considered. Healing. Well, often when we think about healing, we think about either physical healing or we think about psychological healing. But there's other ways that we can think about healing too. And healing is often thought about as a cure or taking away the symptoms, restoring to health. But maybe there's other ways that we want to think about healing. Maybe there's other ways that we should think about healing. And that would be an important part of the discussion here. So it may consider spiritual, physical, and many other ways of approaching healing. Therapy. Now this is the part that for most people is going to be more connected to being a therapist, but I think it'll be relevant even if you're not a therapist. And for those who are therapists, part of what we're going to be looking at is how do we look at and understand healing beyond the psychotherapy room, beyond the psychotherapy hour? How do we help people incorporate in other ways of healing? Or as Art Bohart likes to talk about, how do we help clients become their own healers and help them enhance their own healing? And then diverse. Diverse and diversity, these are very controversial words today. And in talking about diversity, we're going to be talking about various types: cultural, religious, gender, and other forms of diversity, as well as individual diversity. That all of these, I think, are important to consider. That sometimes diversity gets reduced down just to individual differences, and not talking so much about the cultural and religious and the more collective aspects of that. And I think that's a mistake, particularly in a world as diverse as ours. But we also don't want to limit it just to looking at culture or religious differences, what is normally talked about as diversity. So diversity we're going to talk about in diverse ways. There's different aspects of this, but it's an incredibly important aspect to consider. The whole field of psychotherapy, which is something that started in the West, but psychotherapy has impacted our understanding of healing around the world, including countries where mental health services are not even that accessible. So it's had a huge impact on the way that we look at healing all around the world. And this can be something that is limiting in a lot of ways, particularly because it originated so often from some very narrow perspectives. So much of psychology is built on this white European perspective on health and healing, and that just doesn't work for everyone. And also, even when working with clients that may come from that background, there may be a great benefit in being able to look beyond just these traditional ways of healing that we often think about. So we want to really open up the discussion here when we get to this idea of diversity. Effective. I want to start with a quote by Nietzsche. "No shepherd in one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily to the madhouse." I want you to just think about that a little bit at the beginning of our conversation about effectiveness. This was written by Nietzsche about 100 years ago, actually a little over 100 years ago, but it still seems pretty true today. When we look at what is conceived as healthy, we like to use the word normal. What is normal? But is normal necessarily what's healthy? And often what is normal is nothing more than conformity. And conformity is not necessarily something that's going to make everyone feel happy. So this, I think, is something that Nietzsche talks about. And for Nietzsche, this is a diagnosis of the culture in many ways. That there's this push for everyone to be the same. And he's saying, no, that's not necessarily the best thing. What is effective has traditionally been decided by those who are in power, insurance companies. And we still see today that insurance companies make a lot of decisions about what is considered effective, both in terms of if you go into therapy, for example, what will they pay for? They'll only pay for certain types of treatment a lot of times. They'll only pay for certain types of maladies. That there's a lot of different types of struggles that they're not going to pay for. There may be legitimate struggles. And when is a person deemed healthy or healthy enough that they no longer need therapy? Well, often it's insurance companies that make these decisions. And people at insurance companies that have not been trained in mental health that thoroughly. So insurance companies have an incredibly powerful role. Culture. And I would say one of the ways that we see this is through things like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is developed by the American Psychiatric Association. At the time that I'm giving this lecture, they've just been working on the DSM-5 and approved moving forward with the DSM-5. And there's a lot of concerns about this. The Society for Humanistic Psychology has led one of the strong responses to the DSM-5, advocating for a number of significant concerns. But when we look at a number of things about this book, what we see is it really is a book of values, but it's not treated that way. It's a book of what is considered normal. And if you don't fit in with what the American Psychiatric Association considers normal, then there's something wrong with you. And this is unfortunate in a number of situations. As we start to see, one of the big concerns that we have here is when you look at this diversity piece that we talked about a little bit, well, it is common for women and many people from that are not from the dominant culture to get diagnosed more frequently than those people that are a part of the dominant culture. Well, is this because of some type of weakness, or that these people or these groups are more prone to having these problems, or is maybe this reflective of a bias that's in the manual, or bias in the people that are using the manual? But there's some problems here, I think, when we start to look at this. There is some acknowledgement in certain ways at times in the DSM about cultural differences, but I don't think that it looks adequately at the assumptions that are rooted in the very foundation of the DSM. Now, one of the things that I would say is that there is a strong bias against emotion, that there's a strong preference for being rational, being calm in the DSM. And so people that may come from a cultural background that is more emotionally expressive, that is more open to dealing with conflict in a direct manner, these individuals are much more likely to get diagnosed. Does that mean that there's something wrong with them? That there's something wrong with these cultures? I don't think so. And maybe it's even reflective sometimes of pathologies in the dominant culture that's reflected in the DSM. So the DSM, it emerges in many ways from culture, both in that it emerges from a largely United States culture, but also it emerges from a culture of so-called experts in mental health. I say so-called not to question the credentials of the people on the DSM, but to say that to question rather whether they're really experts in a global understanding. So effective often is determined not by the individual that is seeking help, but by individuals that are not even connected to the situation. So I think it is fair then to ask the question, in our traditional standards, does healing then equate conformity? And is that really what much of psychotherapy ends up being about, is helping people conform? This has been discussed from a number of different perspectives. There have been feminist critiques, there have been critiques from critical psychology. James Hillman and Michael Ventura wrote a book, There's Been 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse, that also critiques this. And let me give you one example that kind of emerges from this. And this is an example that I've used often in classes. It's not an actual case example, but rather it's drawn upon a number of experiences with individuals that are actual experiences. So it's very much drawing on something that is real, even though it's a fictionalized case. But an African-American man is hired at a company, is very successful, doing very well at his job, begins to recognize that there are some challenges at this environment, and that there is some prejudices and racism that goes on in this organization. He begins to speak up against these. It's not listened to. He's even chastised some for bringing this up. As he feels ignored and continues to experience this, he becomes increasingly upset. And as he becomes increasingly upset, he starts to voice this more forcefully in ways that within his own culture are very typical. However, within the culture of this particular organization, there's an unwritten rule that we always deal with things calmly. No one raises their voice. No one pushes conflict too much. We all just try and get along. And so as he starts to express things in a way that's very normal in his culture, very healthy in his cultural background, it's viewed in this cultural background as being something that is inappropriate. After he's been at the company for 6 months, he's called in for an evaluation with his supervisor. And his supervisor notes that there had been a number of complaints that he is too aggressive, that he's angry, and doesn't get along well with people. Well, he responds by trying to explain his point again, and his supervisor views this as being defensive and tells him that if he wants to continue to be employed, he needs to seek out some therapy for anger management and start to change his behaviors. So he finds a therapist, he goes in for anger management, tells his story, and the therapist helps him to develop some skills where he can be in this situation calmly, and where he helps him to get better at ignoring the racism that he does see. As he returns to work, and 6 months later comes in for his evaluation, his boss praises him that he's doing a much better job, that he is calmer, that there's no longer any complaints about him, everything's better. But meanwhile, the original concerns that he have been left unaddressed. Other employees that come from various cultural backgrounds also feel like they're being mistreated or suffering because of this, but stay quiet. Now, by all standards of how we typically think of effectiveness, this was an effective experience in therapy. He did better. His job performance improved by the standard of his supervisor. But what about him? Now, this individual, later, after he completed this therapy, sought out a different type of therapy, a depth therapy that allowed him to explore things more. And in this, he started to really unpack and deal with a lot of the messages that he'd been getting at this workplace. And one of the things that came up really quickly was that he started to question who he was. He started to question who he was as a black man. He started to question his culture. So this was a person that was pretty happy and well adjusted when he started. Now is struggling with many different things, even though by the standards of effectiveness, he's done quite well. Have we done a service here? Or, as some in critical psychology would point out, have we actually empowered racism? Have we actually reinforced an oppressive system? Made it easier to remain oppressive? These are difficult questions that I think must be considered. And they don't have an easy answer. That maybe had this individual considered which direction he wanted to go in therapy, he would have chosen the same direction that he went, working to improve his ability to stay calm in these difficult situations because he needed to keep his job. Had a family to support, and he needed his job. Maybe, though, had he been given a choice about what type of therapy that he wanted and was able to think through it, maybe he would have taken a different choice. Maybe he would have focused on how does he more effectively stand up for his rights in this type of situation and advocate for diversity. Maybe he would have chose to start looking for other jobs in a place where he'd be treated better. So we can see that there are a lot of complexities in this question of what is effective.